Hey everyone, it's Mr. Davitt here. I hope you're doing well. I just finished up doing the 60s with you, and as I was going through that, I reminded you that the civil rights movement kind of hit a lot of major strides and really kind of hit its most successes throughout the 1960s. But there's also stuff going on in the 50s in regards to civil rights movement, even to some degree to the 40s. So I thought it'd be more appropriate to kind of just do one specific lesson on the civil rights movement to see the whole thing kind of together and uninterrupted. And obviously, with everything going on today, we know that this is very much something that it has not necessarily been completed, and the quest for civil rights, especially for African Americans in the United States, is something that still is an ever going quest and something that most would agree has not fully been achieved. However, when we talk about the civil rights movement, we are talking specifically about this period in the 1950s and 1960s, uh, variety of protests, variety of action, and a variety of responses that really did lead to some big changes for African Americans in the United States. And I want to start here by kind of looking at the origins of the civil rights movement. And really, I think I got to start this by looking at Black history in the United States. You know, kind of briefly reminding you of all the stuff we've talked about. And there's really one word to describe this, which is that Black history in the United States is extremely brutal. Talking about a group of people forced to come to the United States against their will, basically a source of labor in the South, and really not seen as anything more than kind of property. With the Civil War ending in 1865, the end of slavery came about with the 13th Amendment. And we also saw the 14th Amendment for black citizenship, the 15th Amendment, the rights of blacks to vote during the Reconstruction period. And we saw that that was good, right? These are huge things that occurred. But the reality is, if you remember, states in the South really did all that they could in order to prevent these rights, citizenship, really, from being able to actually be enforced. So that's really problematic. When federal troops left the South in 1877, ending Reconstruction, what Reconstruction needed to achieve as far as black rights were concerned and black protections fell so short. And so that's obviously something that we're discouraged about, we're sad about. And the reality is, even though slavery technically ended in 1865, what developed in its place with sharecropping, with Jim Crow, and other things like that largely resembled slavery. Jim Crow throughout the South, separating white facilities from black facilities. And if you remember, this was Plessy versus Ferguson, where the Supreme Court said it was okay if things were segregated because as long as they were separate but equal. Well, what we saw was definitely separate but horribly unequal, as black facilities, black schools, black modes of transportation were far more inadequate than white schools and white facilities and white restaurants and all those type of things. And we really did see intense discrimination throughout the South. And that was just the reality for blacks, really, into the 20th century. During World War I, some progress as some blacks finally moved out of the South into some northern cities with the war and the need for factory jobs, automobile jobs, sent some into the Detroit and, kind of automobile belt. But most still stuck in the South. And even when they did move to northern cities, they faced discrimination. They faced attacks against them in various race riots and other things like that. In World War II, over 1 million black soldiers fought for the United States. And it's really World War II that we kind of start this with, which is kind of this new outlook and new opportunity that blacks saw in order to exercise their rights and be able to be, equal citizens in the United States. And this is kind of the idea. how can you send us to a foreign land, have us fight a war, risk our lives, yet we're going to return home to the United States and just be seen as nothing? It's unacceptable. And that's why I included this picture here, because if you remember, black soldiers and the black community advocated for the double V in World War II, which was the double victory. Not only victory against the Nazis, against Japan, against Hitler, against fascism, but also to achieve victory at home against discrimination and those type of things. So we really credit World War II with that opportunity and that new kind of energy for the civil rights movement to finally get what they wanted accomplished and be able to do so. So when we talk about early civil rights, I do want to make some comments kind of right after World War II. What were some things that were going on? Well, early civil rights is going to be largely headed by the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored Persons. This organization had been around since the early 1900s, but following World War II, they're going to really decide that this is the time in order to get things done. And what they're going to do is largely legal challenges to segregation, as they set up the Legal Defense Fund within the NAACP. And this is kind of their viewpoint that in order to spark change, they're going to do so through the courts and do so through those type of rulings and other things like that. They really were challenging no more separate but equal. And again, that might seem small, but think about everything that embodied. Okay, that was segregation of society. That was, discrimination, racism, all that type of stuff that they're really putting together. But their viewpoint kind of here was getting rid of separate but equal was the ultimate kind of key for making this happen. The major lawyer for the NAACP is this man that you see here in the picture on the far right. This is going to be Thurgood Marshall. He will later be a Supreme Court justice, and he's going to be leading the charge to kind of get this stuff together. As far as presidential policies are concerned, Truman actually is going to be semi-good for civil rights, as he does something pretty monumental, which is ending segregation in all the military in 1948. So that was pretty significant. That happens. However, it becomes increasingly clear to the NAACP and those champion for the end of segregation and those type of things that the way in which they're going to achieve success and victories is more so through legal challenges and through the courts. So by the early 1950s, some significant things are going to happen in order to make this a reality. First off, what exactly was the situation by 1950s? About 15 million blacks living in the United States by the early 1950s. And even though some had moved into the North, some had moved even into the West, the majority were still in the South. And in the South, they were definitely separate, but they were definitely unequal. And again, you've seen these before. I've shown you this, just how unequal black schools were versus white schools, facilities, access, etc. So that's really what we talk about. Not only that, but also horrible treatment. The reality is lynching, still not a federal crime up to this point. So technically somebody could literally murder somebody who was black and be able to be doing it in the name of justice and nothing would ever happen. And that was really, really tough. And the reality is, an all-white jury in the South would never convict a white man of murder for that. So these were the challenges, these were the fears, and these were the realities for blacks living in the South. So you can imagine just how much of a problem this was. As far as political rights, very few black voters were registered to vote. And this was especially true in the Deep South, states like Alabama, Mississippi, where although the black population was relatively equal to the white population, the difference between the amount of registered voters was really, really severe. And that had a lot to do with the tactics that state and local governments would use in order to prevent blacks from being able to vote. Things like literacy tests. um, things like poll taxes, other points of manipulation, basically meant to keep blacks off the voter roll and being able to actually register to vote. So this is also going to be a serious problem and something that the civil rights movement is going to try to fix as this goes on. Eisenhower himself had little interest in civil rights, but a lot of things are going to happen during his presidency that's going to kind of force him into action, and I'll show you these things as we progress through. The big person that we kind of credit for so much of what happened as far as civil rights and legal challenges will be Earl Warren, who will be the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court through the 50s, and what is called the Warren Court, basically the court he is the Chief Justice of. And the decisions they make are really going to be monumental as far as opening up civil rights, new freedoms for individuals, really, really significant things that go on with Earl Warren and his court. These changes we'll kind of look at here and there, but the first kind of big one that ultimately is the first huge victory for the civil rights movement is the decision made by the Warren Court in regards to Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas in 1954, where the Warren Court will determine that segregation in schools is unconstitutional. This huge change, direct contradiction to what had been the case since really the end of the Civil War, which had been segregation in schools and everywhere else. And this is going to be a big civil rights victory. And so again, it's not going to change things overnight. It's really important to realize that. But the fact that the Supreme Court will rule like this is a huge step forward for the civil rights movement and will ultimately spark kind of what occurs over the next about 10-ish years. This, by the way, was the quote specifically said by the Supreme Court in 1954. We conclude that in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. Separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. Really powerful here. Absolutely true. They were unequal, but it took this major Supreme Court ruling in 1954 in order to break this down. So let's talk about some civil rights action, because we really do credit this decision with what's going to happen relatively quickly as far as trying to not only implement Brown versus Board, but also spark other major changes to end segregation, not only in public schools, but really all facilities and things like that. So one of the big things that's going to happen shortly after the Brown versus Board case is the arrest of Rosa Parks in Montgomery, Alabama. And you've probably heard the story of Rosa Parks before. Rosa Parks, we hear the story that, she was, tired. She sat in the front of the bus where she wasn't supposed to be seated. Somebody came up and told her to move. She didn't, and then she was arrested. That's not false necessarily, but do realize that it was a little more coordinated than that. Rosa Parks was a major civil rights activist. She picked the specific bus driver because she knew that he was especially more racist, and she figured he would, get fed up, which he did because he called the police when she refused to get up out of her seat and was arrested. And what happened was, like what you see in this picture here, these images were taken of Rosa Parks being arrested, her being fingerprinted and things, and some people are going to say, this is ridiculous. This woman is getting arrested for what? Not getting up on her seat from the bus? What type of horrible law is this? And that's going to be kind of the reaction that comes into play. And because of this event, there's going to be a mobilization of the people in Montgomery. And for 1 year, they will boycott the city buses in Montgomery, refusing to ride them. And even though Rosa Parks was kind of the person that first started this, it will really be Martin Luther King Jr., that the young minister from Alabama that will really spearhead this effort, and he's going to really, appeal to the people of Montgomery and tell them, we got to stay strong, we got to continue this. If we stop, before anything's happened, then that's not going to do us any good. So we need to push this. We need to continue through this, etc. Well, after over a year, the buses in the city will be officially desegregated. The boycott will end, but only because they achieved their initial goal and what they wanted. Very powerful, very significant. That goes on here when we're looking at protest and action leading to change. King's leadership will lead to the formation of another civil rights group. This is going to be the SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. This is also going to be a really significant group because King is going to be the major leader of it, but it's also meant to involve the black churches because really the black churches were by far the best institutions to communicate with large amount of black population. Really nothing else in black cities or anything like that they could do this. So the black churches, getting them involved, getting the ministers, the pastors involved, really, really important part of this. And again, King will be not only the leader of the SCLC, but he's also going to be this major civil rights leader. Here's King, by the way, during the Montgomery bus boycotts, and you can see, Young here. This is what's going to move him from kind of being a local figure to moving into the national realm. There'll be other things as well, but very well spoken, good charisma, good leadership, good ability to connect. Now, why was the Montgomery bus boycott successful? Well, many reasons you do want to realize, but one of the big things was persistence and the ability of blacks to be able to still get around and not use the buses. One of the reasons why the bus boycott was so successful was because African Americans made up 75% of the riders on the buses in Montgomery. So when they decided not to ride, that obviously was a huge hit for the city, all right, as they lost, 75% of their customers. But blacks were willing to continue with this fight against this injustice and walked basically to their jobs, walked from place to place, went miles in order to do so, where obviously taking the bus would have been a lot easier, but decided that this was necessary in order to get change. We also see that obviously not everyone's going to be able to walk, so blacks donated their cars for the cause in order to transport people that had to go relatively large distances or elderly or, physically unable to do so. So a lot of coordination here in order to make this successful. And here, by the way, we see the logo here for the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the SCLC, and King as the clear leader. But also other figures in there, primarily religious figures that are also going to be successful. So it's important to realize that even though the Supreme Court made the decision of Brown versus Board in 1954, there's going to be resistance, so-called massive resistance, by many Southern governors and many Southern politicians in order to basically fight against desegregation. And it's one of the reasons why this is going to take a little bit longer to kind of fully come together and for this kind of integration to actually occur. And by the way, when the Supreme Court makes their decision in Brown versus Board, they just tell the governments to move forward in deliberate speed. They don't really give a strict timetable. So different states had different decisions on what kind of to do here. Well, what we're going to notice is that Ike, at this point, although not a big civil rights pioneer or leader, is going to need to make some necessary decisions in order to promote integration. And also to show that this is an objective of the federal government. So in 1957 in Little Rock, Arkansas, there was a decision made to slowly integrate Central High School, which was the big high school down in Little Rock. And the plan was to just start with 9 black students in 1957 to attend Central High School, be the first black students at the school. On the morning, which was supposed to be their first day, the governor of Arkansas ordered the National Guard in order to block the students from being able to attend Central High. Really big move here, but showing his commitment to segregation and not making integration a reality. Eisenhower had a choice here. He could have left it alone and just kind of decided to push away from it. But really, what we see here is Eisenhower wanted to make it very clear to the southern states the Brown versus Board decision had been made and they needed to follow through with it. And so that's why Ike will make the decision to send troops in to get the students to class and basically override the Arkansas governor, Faubus, and the decisions he had made. Big deal going on here. This group of students that did bravely attend school were known as the Little Rock Nine, and again, commitment to attend even when their access was blocked, and so much of a situation that the decision was made for the troops to actually come in to escort the students to class, and that's what you see in this image here. And this, by the way, you can imagine this is a public high school in Little Rock, Arkansas. Literally troops lined up everywhere to get the students into class. And this, by the way, is a really famous image from the Civil Rights Movement. This is one of the Little Rock Nine students, and this was her being screamed at. Chants like lyncher, lyncher, get out of here, other profanities, lewd comments, etc. But the reality of what these students had to face as far as discrimination. All right, so let's look at some of the specific action that's going to take place in order to try to draw attention to the civil rights movement and for blacks to be able to advance their situation and get out of their second-class status in the United States. A big thing stressed by Martin Luther King, you've heard this before, is always going to be nonviolence and going to be this idea of challenging segregation. And so what they're going to kind of do in a lot of instances is they're going to technically do something illegal, but it's really only illegal because of segregationist law. And so what they're trying to do is kind of show how kind of idiotic almost these laws are and how they don't belong. So one tactic that's going to be used starting in 1960 is going to be the sit-ins. Basically, what happens at our first sit-in in Greensboro, North Carolina, is that a group of black students will come in and they're going to sit at a lunch counter that was supposed to be whites only and then just kind of sit there. And technically, their presence there is going to be illegal. Next day, they'll come back. There's going to be even more. And throughout the week, more and more people will come. And again, always nonviolent. They sit there. And what's interesting, though, and I'll show you some images of this, is even though they will be nonviolent, their reaction against them will oftentimes be violent and be pretty scary. So kind of an interesting development there. There's also going to be other ins that are going to occur, things like read-ins at all-white libraries, wade-ins at beaches, all of which trying to show, the injustices of segregationist policy and how even though they're breaking the law, it's almost one of those things like how can this even be considered breaking the law? We're going to see violence take place against the protesters, again, pretty vicious, and it's going to make it challenging for them to be able to do this, but a lot of stress on nonviolence and still maintaining that as this goes forward. It's the sit-ins that are largely conducted by students that is going to lead to another civil rights organization, which is going to be the SNCC, or the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, that's going to really push some other initiatives and getting younger people involved in the protests and in the action as well. The emphasis will be on nonviolence. Okay, that's going to still be SNCC's goal. However, some, especially as time continues, will grow increasingly frustrated. And you can imagine why they're stressing nonviolence, but violence is oftentimes being hit on them. Here's some of that violence I was talking about against people partaking in sit-ins. And some more here. And again, this is, the violence that had to be taken into account and the risk that was at play here, but something that many felt was necessary in order to achieve end goals. And we see here the SNCC or SNCC for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Okay, so as we hit into the 1960s, some more civil rights action, and that has a lot to do with the fact that JFK will be more supportive of civil rights than Eisenhower. However, he's not going to just be jumping out there saying, oh, yeah, I'm civil rights, civil rights. Not quite, because again, there were still many in the United States, especially in the South, that were against it, and he ultimately needed their support in order to be successful. So that is something that you do kind of want to look at here, because it's not just overnight. Again, still change is going to come at a semi-slow pace. So what we'll notice here is that the Freedom Rides will take place in 1961. So Montgomery bus boycotts, that was challenging city buses, specifically in Montgomery. But the Freedom Rides and the Freedom Riders are going to challenge segregation for interstate bus passengers. So as the map depicts here, they're going to start in Washington, D.C., and then they're going to look to move themselves all the way into New Orleans. And that was kind of the plan of what they were going to do. And as they took the ride, they were going to challenge and basically violate the segregation laws. So, for example, black passengers would sit in white-only sections. Whites and blacks would sit together. Again, that wasn't supposed to be allowed. Other things like that. Well, as they drive through and as they start to reach, especially into the deeper parts of the South, Alabama, Mississippi, massive violence will be wreaked upon these people by groups of basically white supremacists who can't stand for what they're doing. So much so that a bus is even set on fire. This will force John F. Kennedy to intervene so the Freedom Riders can have a little bit more of a successful ride, but still showing apprehension and really the commitment, especially in places like Alabama and Mississippi, into not making integration a reality and keeping with segregation policies. Similar situation occurring as far as colleges are concerned in regards to resistance. A lot of resistance, especially at University of Alabama and Ole Miss, so much so that protection will once again have to be sent in order to get James Meredith to successfully enroll at Ole Miss, thus becoming its first black student. Again, some progress being made here, but really tough. A lot of violence from certain groups in the South, and really kind of not huge progress being made up to this point. Here, by the way, is a look at our Freedom Riders carrying signs, other things like that. And this, by the way, is the bus that's set on fire. Luckily, they're able to get out, but, showing just how serious this is. At one point, the people on the bus were attacked by a white mob. Really, really tough stuff. And by the way, the Freedom Riders were technically arrested in Mississippi for what they did, but the conviction was overturned by the Supreme Court. Thankfully. Okay, and here we see James Meredith and his enrollment at Ole Miss, and we see people there to basically protect him from being able for white violence and being able to actually attend school. Okay, so let's talk about some more calls to action that are going to take place when we're looking at the civil rights movement. Martin Luther King will make the decision to go to Birmingham, Alabama, and the reason being was because at the time, Birmingham was the most segregated U.S. city. And so his decision here is to go down into really the heart of where this all was going on in order to show just how serious and how bad things were. And sure enough, Martin Luther King and the protesters, when they go to Birmingham, they are going to be met with massive violence. You see here police firefighters using fire hoses, dogs against the peaceful protesters. However, TV cameras are there, and they're going to be filming this, and more people that do not live in the South are going to look at this and say, wow, this is really something. Okay, this is evident to us that there are serious issues and serious problems here. Another thing that we're going to look at here is JFK after Birmingham. saying, hey, look, it's my goal to get something done here. All right, this cannot continue. He's going to call the civil rights issue a moral issue, and that's going to be something that, again, shows kind of his priorities and where he saw things as going. Not too long after this, we're going to see probably the most televised and kind of our biggest protest that occurs in Washington, D.C., where 200,000 people will march on to Washington. Kind of the idea here, if the government won't listen, we need to bring the protest to the government's doors. And they're going to be protesting for better treatment, better jobs, better economic situation, and just overall equality. And that's something that we're definitely going to notice as this goes through. The March on Washington is oftentimes remembered for Martin Luther King's most famous speech, which would be his I Have a Dream speech. And again, more and more people being drawn to the cause that weren't necessarily before, and more of a feeling that action needed to take place sooner rather than later. Again, this is another image from the Birmingham campaign. When a typical Americans see this and this type of treatment, they're gonna be mortified, and for a lot of people, they didn't quite understand just how bad segregation was, just how bad racism was in the South, and so these are the images that they're gonna look at and say, "Wow, change needs to come." See here, this look here of the March on Washington. Another look. And here's King with his I Have a Dream speech. Again, televised, so it will be broadcast on the major networks, so people are going to be able to hear it who were not necessarily of the 200,000 that were there at the protests and the march. Okay, so finally in 1964, we're going to see something pretty big happen. First, though, we're going to see something tragic happen, which we talked about in the 60s lecture, the assassination of John F. Kennedy. Really sorrow for the country. Young president died, and definitely sorrow for the civil rights movement. This was kind of the guy there, the leader that said, "Hey, look, I'm going to make this work. I'm going to get us together. I'm going to make this a reality." Really had given more emphasis and more kind of commitment to civil rights than certainly Eisenhower and Truman, and now all of a sudden he's dead. Big fear for the civil rights movement. What's going to happen next? Well, the good news is that LBJ, when he takes over, is going to also be committed to passing the civil rights bill. What's interesting here is that LBJ will kind of use JFK's assassination as a rallying cry, saying, "Hey, look, we need to do this in John's memory." Okay, he was a great guy. He was really committed to this. We need to really make this happen and make this a reality. It's going to be tough to get passage of this bill, mainly because of Southern congressmen who are really going to fight it till the very end in order to try to prevent it from being passing. But with some good compromising, some good politicking, it's going to get the necessary votes in order to succeed and be passed. So what are some of the key points here in the Civil Rights Act? No racial discrimination in any public place, period. So this time, instead of Brown versus Board, which was just public schools, now it's everywhere. Okay, so no racial discrimination extended to everywhere. Huge victory. Increased power here of the federal government in order to make sure that racial discrimination doesn't happen, and also to go after people that commit hate crimes, commit racially motivated crimes, all that kind of stuff, because we know that the state governments, they weren't doing it down in the South. Okay, they refused to prosecute people that lynched blacks and other things like that. They say, "Hey, listen, now it's our power to be able to go after those type of people." Big success here. Another thing that's important, no employee discrimination. So again, these are going to be huge things that are going to be really, really big steps in the right direction. And here we see LBJ, Martin Luther King, at the passage of and the signing of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Okay, for as good as the Civil Rights Act was, it still had a major downside. And that downside was it did not give any protections or any abilities to be able to vote. And so that's obviously a serious concern because, as we've talked about before, very few black registered voters in the South. And so this is obviously a really serious problem. So, in order to try to combat that, in the summer of 1964, volunteers will descend upon the state of Mississippi in what is dubbed the Freedom Summer. And this is their plan: come down to Mississippi, register black voters so they can get on the register and be able to vote. And it's a noble plan. It's a lot of college students from up north that are going to say this is how they're going to spend their summer. And there's an unfortunate turn that happens very early on, which is that 3 volunteers are going to actually be captured by the local section and the local chapter of the Ku Klux Klan and be brutally killed. All right. And actually, it was coordinated by the sheriff in Mississippi. Okay. Very tragic, very sad, but just showing how committed some were to making civil rights not a reality. In order to fight for rights, Martin Luther King will organize a march from Selma to Montgomery. And as the marchers are coming in, they are going to be brutally attacked by the police. Again, a very, very grim, sad, horrible situation. Well, finally, they're going to be given the right to march in a very great march that occurs from Selma to Montgomery. You see the image here of it. And it's, largely this momentum that will lead to the next key piece of civil rights legislation, which will be the Voting Rights Act of 1965. This officially eliminates literacy tests or any other barrier to voting that Southern states employed. And once again, similar to what happened with the Civil Rights Act, this gives the federal government more power to come in and be able to register voters. So that was seen as being incredibly important to be able to take care of things. Again, this law, very important, very significant, is successful. And what's really important to note about this is that it does lead to a huge increase in the number of black voters throughout the South. Okay, here, by the way, is our some of our volunteers for Freedom Summer. These are the 3 men that go missing. The guy in the middle, James Chaney, he was from Mississippi, but the other 2 were from New York area, come down to help volunteer in this, and then captured and killed for their work as being volunteers trying to get blacks registered to vote. Very tragic. This was the car that they were driving. It was finally found. Really, really sad. And here, by the way, is an image from the Selma before it was given the authorization to go. This was the violence that was put on here. And then here we see Lyndon Johnson signing the voting rights in. And again, big kind of quote here from Lyndon Baines Johnson. And this graph really shows just how well the Voting Rights Act was able to make things happen. And so what you see here is in 1965, right before the Voting Rights Act was passed, you see the total registered white, total registered black voters, and then the gap between them. And you can see, like, for example, in Mississippi, 63% gap between white voters that were able to be registered versus black. Wow, just really dramatic. And then we see here what happened after this point. Okay, we can see that all of a sudden it became far more equal as blacks were finally able to vote, and that gap became so much less. Here we see African American elected officials in the United States, and we definitely see this number risen. And again, that has so much to do with the fact that, again, with the black right to vote, that means their voice is going to be able to be heard. So let's talk about some kind of issues that occur, because it's not all going to be perfect. And this has a lot to do with the Black Power movement. So only a little short time after the passage of the Voting Rights Act, a riot's going to take place in Watts, California in 1965. And this has to do with a arrest of a black man and some of the ensuing things that occurred afterwards. and it's going to lead to burning and looting to take place all throughout Watts in 1965. And so what the Watts riot shows us is that the problems facing blacks in the northern parts of the country and the western part of the country was very different from the problems in the South. Okay, there wasn't segregation necessarily, at least formal, in the North and the West. Okay, but they were still treated poorly. All right, there was still informal segregation. So something like the Civil Rights Act didn't necessarily fix that. Okay, also big economic issues. The Watts riot is also an example of violent confrontation between black protesters and um, whites, and that's something that unfortunately will take place here and will kind of continue on throughout the later part of the 60s. And so this is probably someone you've heard of before, Malcolm X, who will advocate for black separation. So as opposed to Martin Luther King saying, white and black hand in hand, he's going to say that's no good. Malcolm X sadly be assassinated. And then what we're also going to have is the Black Panther Party, which is going to be kind of this radical group that's going to advocate for black power. And out of this, they advocate for a separate black identity. So they're going to really celebrate, African American distinctiveness, African American hairstyles like the afro. They're going to change their names to more traditional African names. And they're going to cause a lot of death and destruction as things, as they move in here and as things get kind of out of control. And again, these people will carry with them weapons and other things like that. We'll see continued riots that will occur, throughout, northern parts of the country and the western parts of the country as they fight more and more. And after Voting Rights and Civil Rights Act, the rhetoric kind of turns into economic issues because the reality is major economic problems for African Americans throughout the entire country, high levels of poverty, high levels of unemployment, those type of things. And Martin Luther King will decide that he's going to go, do kind of a tour of the country and try to talk to black business owners and other things in order to help the black economic situation. And unfortunately, that falls short when in 1968 he's assassinated. And so this is really kind of a tragic scene, especially as somebody that advocated so much for peace and nonviolence will be pushed away. And here we see some images here of this. And here we see the Black Panther Party. And here we see them here again. This kind of unique identity and, carrying weapons. So this is when things have the potential to get definitely dangerous. And this is an image taken of MLK right before he was assassinated. And riots will actually ensue throughout the country following the death of Martin Luther King. So now that we've talked about the civil rights movement, I want to kind of just wrap up by kind of evaluating the civil rights movement. So was it a success? Well, first off, absolutely. Okay, really shows us the power of nonviolent action to get things moving. And so that's really important to pay attention to. Definitely saw concrete changes happening with the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. This is very good. Okay, that's really, really significant. Okay, however, to think that this just completely ended discrimination would be short-sighted. It definitely did not, and discrimination still continued. Voting Rights Act, though, did place blacks as people that needed to be considered when decisions were being made for the country, something that really hadn't happened as they were mostly ignored up to this point. And definitely something, though, that has been an issue and even continues to be an issue are economic issues for the African American population. Still higher levels of poverty, higher levels of unemployment, less college graduates, more dropouts than the kind of average population. So these are still issues that come into play and have not necessarily been resolved. Again, also heavy levels of racism and prejudice still. And again, if you've been following what's been going on in the news, you can obviously see just how serious this is and how it still hasn't been resolved. But definitely the civil rights movement, a great story about making change happen, using nonviolence to achieve that, and seeing whites, blacks together in order to make meaningful change. Thanks so much. We'll do Vietnam next. Also, kind of going on at this period as well. So, talk about again the loaded 60s, a lot of stuff going on. And I hope you got something out of this. Talk soon.